Hello everyone and welcome in today's session. I hope you're all having a good day. I'm Albarina, the organizer of this webinar. Me and Josh Albarina, the presenter of this webinar, will be with you for a 30-minute presentation of selecting the appropriate risk assessment techniques. The risk assessment process is central to the overall formal safety assessment and therefore should be linked to the hazard identification process and control measure selection process. The purpose of this risk management webinar is to provide the participants with a detailed understanding of selecting the adequate techniques for risk management. This session will cover the following issues: the factors and constraints in conducting risk assessment, new perspectives on the common techniques used for risk assessment, and the concepts to assert techniques or combinations to apply. Mr. Albarina is a leading PCB certified ISO 31000 risk manager in the Philippines. Currently, he is the senior consultant for ISO programs of SaaS management. I would kindly ask the audience to write any questions that you may have during the webinar in the chat box, and Josh will try to answer them in the question and answer session. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy this webinar. Josh, time is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Alba, and good day, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on risk management. Today, I will be talking more about selecting the appropriate risk assessment techniques. So this is something not technically a new subject, although we all know being professionals experienced in handling risk management within an organization or in the enterprise. So we're very much acquainted with the risk assessment techniques, from the identification, analysis, identification, analysis, and evaluation and treatment. So we are very fond about those risk assessment techniques. But in this case, the challenge of us taking a step forward, or should we say improving further on risk assessment techniques, happens to be always a very clincher question, and when we are always more keen on what techniques are we going to use. So we're going to talk about a bit. We're going to talk about a bit of techniques, but more importantly, what makes us the right decision, or critical thinking, or use critical thinking in selecting the risk assessment techniques. Although in this session, we'll be more focused on the critical aspects, or the critical thought points on selecting the techniques depending on the context. As we all know that selecting the techniques will vary depending on the context where we are. So the flow of our today's discussion, this will be the rundown of the forum, or the 30-minute session that we have. We're going to have a quick look on the 31,000 framework. So we just have to have a refresher thought about what's enterprise risk management about, so to speak. If you have already taken up the 31,000 certified risk manager at PCB, that will be a big advantage to you. Or the 27,005 risk management in information security, that will be also a great advantage to you as well. And then moving forward from the 31,000 framework, we're going to go deep now on the third block of the framework, which is the risk assessment. As you are aware that in 31,000 framework, we have 3 sections to look at. We're going to talk about a bit on the bottom line, the risk assessments, but the difference is we're going to focus now on the bottom line of having what really is, or what really makes a good risk assessment. And that is the third section of this discussion. And having talked about the critical points, having the good risk assessment, we're going to be browsing several references that correlates with 31,000, and that there are some points in that risk assessment that we ought to see, and that we're going to put it on right here in this discussion. So we're going to try our best to squeeze those thought points in just a matter of 15 minutes. And then after getting yourself acquainted with the thought points, rather than talking about techniques, although we're going to talk about a bit, but we're going to focus more on the thought points, we're also going to close this session with much more. 31,000 guideline, by then you should also have a hand on the 31010, or the Collaborating Standard on the Risk Assessment Tools and Techniques. And by that, we shall now start. We all know that 31,000 consists of 3 blocks, and this contains the major framework of enterprise risk management, the way we all know risk management is. And as much as most of the experts would say that, and would also affirm that for you to have an effective risk assessment, to create value on that, you need to have a good sense of managing the practice, and that is in the form of risk management. And for that risk management to be fully enabled and to see what is the great value to the organization, you have to make them first get the buy-in, taking in the 11 principles as clearly defined in the 31,000 guideline. So as you can see here, we run a back on the framework itself. But if we're going to move forward now, we now put our focus on the third block, which is the risk assessment, and we try ourselves to take an answer to the question, what makes a good risk assessment? So when we talk about the third block, of course, we'll first trickle our way down from in the risk assessment techniques, beginning with identification phase. So let's start with this very critical step, or should we say an equally critical step in the risk assessment, which is risk identification. So when we identify risk, we talk about events, we talk about assets, we talk about risk sources. To simplify things up, we have to, based on the context that we had, or based on the context we identify, we have ourselves face the challenge of finding what are these uncertainties that really can cause impacts to the organization if there's given several threats. That's the heart of identification phase. And in identifying the steps, or should we say in the process of it, we have several techniques to help us. Well, of course, this will also bridge itself in the in the succeeding parts, but we're going to introduce something about some of the techniques. In 31010, the techniques are classified into 7, as you can see there in the screen, and human and organizational factors are also recognized significantly when in the process. It makes also perfect sense since conducting this risk assessment techniques would really take in human factors through the perspective of the analyst when assessing the context, of course given several concrete data from the organization. So we're now clear with the identification phase. We now step in to having a deeper understanding about this list of uncertainties we have formally elicited in the previous phase. So when we talk about analysis, it is about giving these identified risks a deeper level of understanding by putting ourselves to answering 2 questions. What are the impacts and what are the possibilities that it happens? For some of the techniques, there will be also several factors, several questions like if FMEA, there's also the third factor comes in. What is the chance of having it detected? And that is, FMEA is one of the 31 techniques defined in 31010. So to put it, regardless of the techniques, there are always 2 things that in this phase has been talked about. What is the impact and what is its probability? With that, with those 2 factors, we point up ourselves on what is its corresponding risk levels. And in this section, this is more like the more statistical component of risk assessment, since in most practices we always associate descriptive and qualitative and quantitative analysis, or a combination of both, to come up with a certain number most of the time, or to come up with a certain level of risk in which it helps us appreciate the what impact does this bring to the organization. And with these impacts recognized, it helps us move on to the next phase. Before we go for that, by practice, in analysis phase, we typically use estimation methods and consequence sequence analysis. So we have several techniques like the combination of a cause and effect analysis with the fishbone diagrams, bow tie analysis, and then also for data-intensive assessments, we go for statistical methods like the Monte Carlo simulation method, and then the Markov analysis, the Bayesian techniques, and more on the statistical methods. And also the quasi-statistical type, we have the fault tree, event tree, failure modes, effects analysis. So all of these factors, the bottom line is that it challenges the assessor in putting up a certain figure. And that would give us a good level, a good level of risk, which we'll be using it to evaluate them based on a given criteria by the organization. This is the evaluation phase. This gives us a hint. Now that we know the levels, we want to know what comes first. And we always put them on heat map and on risk maps and sometimes in tabulated form. But the bottom line is it gives us an idea what to give us a sorting advantage to identify what type of risk should I treat first, should I put this on the bucket list of what to do, and then what to anticipate. Of course, as much as we have passed through all the first three levels, and then we're going to proceed with the next stage of treating risk, one thing is for sure, a risk assessment and treating the risks does not give you an absolute guarantee that it is treated 100%. There will be always residuals. And as per completely explained, despite the fact that there's an inherent risk when you treat them, there will be always left with residuals. And that shows that regardless of the techniques, it's not at all time a perfect choice. But what's clear is that we can mitigate it for most, as is concretely defined in 31,000 and in 31010. So I have already mentioned in the past few minutes, I've introduced several techniques, and after running through on the risk assessment methodology, the risk assessment sequences, we're now in the core of answering the question, what makes a good risk assessment then? So we have three factors to use that, because of course, it goes without saying that the management has already given you a mandate. Given that you have done risk assessment, it also naturally follows that they have already had a good risk management framework in place. And why not? It should be because the risk management framework enables the organization to create value from every risk assessment conducted within the context of the organization. So having said that it's a management framework, there are factors that one organization or the risk manager must take into full consideration. First is when you do a risk assessment, do you have the right resources? Is the technique doable within the bounds of my resources? That's number one. And then number two, based on the context of where you are after fully identifying the internal context, the external context, the expectations of your stakeholders, and what's in it for you when you're going to do a risk assessment, is the technique that you're going to use exactly appropriate to the context of the organization? Because not at all time you can use a cause and effect analysis when all you need to do is to have an intensive statistical analysis on it. It doesn't make sense. So you have it should be also, and I will mention it a bit, that and also for in some of you who have attended several risk assessment risk management seminars or risk assessment seminars or risk management seminars, it's very clear and apparently so that for one to do an effective risk assessment, you got to be very expert on it. That means you get to have the experience, the skills, the attitude when it comes to it. In short, to simplify things up, you're more of an expert in the field where you chose to be. And this second factor would really represent that aspect. The third one is you're familiar with the technique, right? It's easy. You can who can do a fault tree analysis and event tree analysis? You can do that technique. Yes, it's fine. But can the whole team do it? Not all members can do it, or at least a few can do it, but not as intensive as one. So we're talking about the complexity of the application. Is it something that everyone can do? More importantly, when you do it and have the results clear, is it something that your management can understand? in most of the seminars, most of the meetings, you're only given a short fraction of their time to listen to you. So with that little span of time, you ask yourself, what would be the right message for me to tell them? And if the result of my analysis would give me or take me long periods of time, I have to change my skill. I have to change my technique. I got to make sure that my tools should properly interpret the assessment, that should interpret what the top management expects of you. And when the management sees the value behind it, only then can we properly say that the technique is there. So specifically, there are some things we can classify eventually, which is a good start. So now I'm putting down things. What are these specific factors to look at? So we have the objectives of the study, the needs of the decision makers, the types and range of risks being analyzed, potential magnitude of the consequences. I mentioned earlier the degree of expertise and the resources needed, and the availability of information and data, and if you're going to do a risk assessment, is it something that I can update it as fast as possible? And on top of it, is it something that complies to legal and contractual requirements? Which is why there are some countries who adopt several risk assessment framework or risk management framework, and that would also follow that. In the U.S., you have the COSO as a bridge to comply with SOX and HIPAA. For New Zealand, we have the Australian standard and New Zealand standard for it, and in the Philippines, we go for basically what the auditing the local standards would comply. The same context also with your country as to what are the contractual requirements would there be to comply, so that if I follow the assessment, it shows that I am in tune with them. More importantly, I've given value to the organization by putting us a good reputation. And simply put, in all of these 8 factors, all of them are equally critical when we want to find out what makes a good risk assessment technique. And as mentioned in the guideline in 31010, you can choose one or a combination of both. So as long as at the end of the session, at the end of the risk assessment, they are something that that shows reasonable results to the top management. It is something that every team can perform? And is it something that it is within the bounds of the budget? And is it something that the data can be manipulated for? And is it something that well represents the nature of the risks? So all of these factors, to wrap things up, we have 4 watch points that I can leave. First is in the assessments and results may practically vary, and then it will depend on the depth of the detail. And that's why in the risk analysis, that's why in the risk analysis, for as much as you can, the team must be able to really drill themselves to a careful analysis, such a manner that at the end of that session, you will be able to evaluate the risk properly. Just keep in mind that a good risk a well-evaluated risk will depend on how well it is analyzed. That also follows that how well is the risks properly identified. And finally, as I have already outlined the succeeding 2 bullet points, which risk assessment techniques. The use techniques must be justifiable, and that it must provide results that enables a good understanding of the risk. And finally, as it is a risk management, or should we say, as the risk assessment constitutes the entire bulk of performing it and putting it in a risk management framework, it is something that as it moves forward within the enterprise, it is the results, the action plans, the histories behind the information that was collected should be something that's traceable, repeatable, and verifiable. There's a challenge for most organizations that when you talk about implementing a risk management framework, we're left with the question, is it something that's auditable? A lot of people are asking that. Is risk management, is 31,000 an auditable standard? Well, as much as it is a guideline, and it contains should statements, it follows that it is not. But it is something that gives us a good benefit, because the 31,000 also tells us that you can create a criteria that enables the risk management framework to be auditable by nature. And how auditable will that be? It will depend on the organization. And it really is up to the organization. After all, it goes in the principle. If you have attended the previous webinar on the principles of principles and culture, which I conducted some months back, we talked about risk management framework is something that's custom tailored, not a one-size-fits-all scheme. And with that, as it is a 30-minute webinar, and as much as there are a lot of things that could be talked about about assessing risk or selecting the techniques. I'm much open to listen to your questions, everyone. See how can we steer up a conversation. So before I would close it off, I'll just go back to this slide so that you will remember so that it will be easily remembered. What are these three things that you need to remember when you select a risk assessment technique? First, resources. Second is the degree of uncertainty that you are dealing with, and finally, how complicated should the application be? And with that, I'm leaving you with this deck. I'm turning it now to Alba for some questions. Alba, thank you very much.
Thank you, George, very much for this informative webinar. I would like to ask the audience to ask your questions now. In the meantime, I will start with the first question. What is the difference between a risk assessment and a method statement?
Method statement. Okay. When you talk about a risk assessment, it is a full technique on, we all know that in risk assessment, it's a four-step approach of identifying, analyzing, and evaluating and treating of risks. That's clear. That's defined in 31,000. When we talk about a method statement, it is something that you have to present what is the methodology that you're going to use to approach a certain problem. In this case, it has an open boundary. It may be confined into analyzing a problem. It can be confined into organizing your things that enables you to identify problems. Because as there are many methodologies that one can use in as many methodologies as there be, it's about also the thing about the risk assessment is that regardless of the context, we are left with understanding or triggering on the uncertainties of in a very systematic approach. For method statement, it is something that you have to define the methodology, and at the same time you also have to address certain contexts. I hope I got your answer there.
Thank you, Josh, for the answer. The next question is, can you please list and explain the most and commonly used risk assessment techniques?
Good question. Well, the preliminary risk assessment is one of the most common, the commonly used technique. On my experience, let me elicit 5. The first common technique is the cause and effect diagram or the fishbone diagram, where it's very popular for many sectors, like for BPO, for manufacturing, regardless. The concept is very universal in such a manner that for a certain effect, what are the causes? And the causes are elicited by them as interpreted by the main bones. What complements the fishbone there's a beauty behind in this fishbone diagram, because in the fishbone diagram you are given a certain effect and you have to look for the causes. The other tool that complements or adds beauty to the risk assessment to this technique is the bow tie method, where you're given a certain event, you have to identify the causes, and you also have to identify the effects. Not only them, but you also have to identify the factors that would either inhibit them or enable them. So these techniques are will complement each other, but between the two, the number one is the fishbone diagram. Second technique, it's the failure mode and effects analysis. This is very popular, used to be very popular in the automotive sector, especially when for any given any given process, you have to look for the process failure mode, the potential failure modes. And, and the thing about this one, despite the tedious of its implementation, it provides a level of detail or that gives a practitioner a forecast of what's going to happen and what can go wrong. Because in this sector where it originates, a single flaw in the process can really can already connect several damages, considering that the nature of the production process in this industry. That's why the failure mode effects analysis apparently is very significant to them and eventually made mainstream across manufacturing sectors regardless of whether you're in the production, whether you are in the facilities management. Even ESCOs, they're also using it. That's the second one. The third tool is the fault tree analysis. Right now, it's also picking up popularity, particularly in power sectors, especially when they were to look for, when they are going to trace down what can possibly go wrong and look for the logic behind of what can possibly go wrong. On top of it, with the fault tree analysis, what also complements this one is the reliability block diagrams, which enable us to identify the possible chances of its occurrence. So with this fault tree analysis, if you couple it with the reliability block diagram for the statistical component of it, it enables the user, or it enables the risk assessor to not just only elicit the factors, but quantify them. So it makes a double advantage for it. The fourth tool, which is eventually much misplaced because this should be the first one, is brainstorm. The brainstorm technique is a very popular method. In fact, by experience, you can't do identification, analysis. You can't do the entire risk assessment if you don't do the brainstorm. Even in the auditing of the risk management framework, as for some companies who have it as an auditable one, you can't do it without a brainstorm technique. So this is apparently is one of the significant tool that has ever been introduced in 31010 guideline, recognizing its simplicity and its qualitative approach. The fifth one, so wait a minute, I'm just going to run down the illustration. Okay. The fifth one, I think I have to I'm already stuck at 4, so I'll have to stay there at 4. But what apparently is clear that of these 4 techniques, there are neighboring techniques that are associated most of the time. And there are some techniques that if you look at it, it comes with a good complement. So I can elicit at least 4 out of the 4 of the most popular techniques in risk assessment. So I hope we got the answer there.
Thank you, Josh, very much. The third question, which I think you already mentioned, is the ISO 31000 auditable?
No. This sounds so direct, but if you look at it closely, it's not an auditable standard. And as it is mentioned in the formal title of the ISO 31000-2009, risk assessment, enterprise risk management, or guidelines on enterprise risk management. Meaning, say, you can follow it, but it's not necessary that you have to follow it because considering the nature of the document itself, which features a lot of should statements, it's more of recommending rather than requiring compared to any auditable standards like let's take the popular standard ISO 9001, where if you can look and if you can browse through the context, it shows more of a shall statement, meaning to say that clause is auditable. But in 31000, it contains most of the time should statements. So it's very recommending and it's more of recommending in nature, although it's leaving you a hint that if you can find a criteria and you can benchmark 31000 and make it yours, because the company or the enterprise are also compelled to define their own risk criteria. So just to make things to make the efforts reasonably practical, why not the entire management framework? So it's something that most companies have already done. In fact, I've already heard some companies who have already assessed, audited their risk management and have already had what you call this, a maturity level itself. So it will always depend on the organization. But what apparently is clear for the context of everyone, it's at the moment, it's not an auditable standard. But there's good news though, because at the moment it's on the works. There's now the talk about the design specifications, although I can't talk much about it because there's not much information. But if it happens, you'll be if you are at the PCB groups, the ISO 31000, you'll be one of the first to know of the progress on it. The timeline for benefit is that it's going to be subject for 2017. So there you go.
Thank you, Josh. We have another question here. Can the tools be used for information security risk assessment in accordance with ISO 27005?
Can you say it again, Alba?
Yes. Can the tools be used for information security risk assessment in accordance with ISO 27005?
In 310, good question. In 31010, there are 31 techniques, as we all know. Not all techniques you can use them because some techniques there identify 31,000, such as the environmental impact assessment. You cannot use that on 27005 simply because of the nature of the methodology as defined. But it again, as much as I've directly elicited things, it will always depend on the context. Now, there are some. The good thing is, most of the techniques that are identified in the 31010 guideline can be applicable when you do for risk management in 27005. You see, in 27005, it's information security on information security risk management. So it's more dedicated to it's more dedicated to identifying uncertainties or identifying risks in the context of information security. So we're basically dealing with how information navigates within the organization. And so there are some techniques in 31010 that you can use. Like, for example, let's take the simple ones. We can use we can probably use a fault tree analysis, and you can also use a failure mode in effects analysis. It is possible, and also you can use a fishbone and a bow tie diagram. So simply to properly contextualize the risks, or should we say properly identify and analyze the risks on a qualitative and a semi-quantitative levels. So to summarize it in a very simple fashion, some of the techniques in 31010 can be applicable when you do a risk assessment in 27005. There you go.
Thank you, George, for answering the questions. We have here some few more questions, but because of the time limitation, we will be answering them throughout email. Thank you, George, once again for all this informative webinar, and I want to thank all the attendees as well who have joined us today. I hope your questions have been answered. I also want to inform you that this webinar is recorded. It can be found on PCB YouTube channel and in our website, pcb.com. Additionally, PCB appreciates your comments and suggestions. Thus, I would kindly ask you to write down your suggestions on the upcoming webinar topics in the question that will be shown at the very end of this session. Looking forward to seeing you all next week in a very interesting topic as well, the high cost of focusing on risk management instead of on managing risk. Until then, have a great week. Thank you very much, Josh.
Thanks, Alba. Okay.